Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1: The Quiet Life of a Ghost. The fluorescent lights of the Paxton Corp open-plan office hummed at a frequency most people ignored, but to Alexander von Hagen, they were the sound of safety. He sat at desk 402, a nondescript gray slab decorated with a single, dying succulent and a mug that said "World's Okayest Employee." For a man who had once spent a month as a high-stakes art appraiser in Zurich and another 3 as a structural engineer in Dubai, being "okay" was a hard-won luxury. Alexander adjusted his non-prescription glasses, the thick frames softened the sharp, observant edge of his jawline, and toggled through the lines of Project Moonshine's back end. "Hey, Alex," a voice chirped. It was Sarah from marketing, hovering over his shoulder with a panicked look. "My laptop is doing the blue screen of death thing again. IT said it'll be 3 hours, but I have a pitch in 20 minutes. Alexander didn't look up, his fingers still dancing across his mechanical keyboard. "Did you try the hard reset?" "Twice." Alexander sighed, a practiced sound of mild corporate exhaustion. He stood up, his lean frame moving with a deceptive, liquid grace he usually tried to stiffen into a slouch. He walked to her desk, took a look at the port, and saw the issue immediately: a bent pin in the docking station was shorting the motherboard. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver paperclip. With the dexterity of a world-class neurosurgeon, or a master lockpicker, he flicked the metal into the port. A sharp click, a quick repositioning of the battery, and the laptop whirred to life. "Oh my God, you're a wizard!" Sarah gasped. "Just a hobbyist," Alexander lied smoothly, his voice flat and unmemorable. "I saw a YouTube video on hardware maintenance once. It's mostly just luck." He retreated to his desk before she could ask more. Visibility was the enemy of longevity. He had been Alexander von Hagen for 3 years now, his longest run yet. He had forged the tax returns, the university transcripts, even a digital trail of a boring childhood in Ohio. This was the last mask. The one he intended to wear until he turned to dust. He turned his attention back to the Moonshine source code. It was a beautiful application, designed to bridge every bank account, investment portfolio, and crypto wallet a user owned into one interface. But as he ran a routine diagnostic on the transaction ledger, his eyes narrowed. There was a stutter in the data packet. Alexander leaned in. Most analysts would see it as a rounding error, a fraction of a cent lost to the ether. But Alexander knew how money moved. He knew how to hide it, and more importantly, he knew how to find it when it didn't want to be found. He opened a private terminal, his boring persona slipping away as his mind shifted into the predatory rhythm of a grifter. He bypassed the UI and dived into the kernel. There it was. A ghost script, buried under layers of legitimate encryption. It was elegant. It was professional. It was malicious. Every time a user moved money through Moonshine, the app skimmed exactly 2%. It wasn't an interest charge or a service fee. It was a silent siphon, rerouting the funds through a daisy chain of proxy servers, first to a shell company in the Caymans, then to a numbered account in Cyprus, before disappearing into a dark hedge fund. Millions, Alexander whispered to himself, his heart hammering against his ribs. They're siphoning millions a week. If Moonshine launched on Friday, the SEC would be at Paxton Corp's doors by Monday. And when federal investigators started digging into the employees who had access to the code, they wouldn't just find the thief. They would find him. They would find that Alexander von Hagen didn't exist before 2023. They would find the fingerprints of a ghost. "Damn it," he hissed, rubbing his temples. He had worked so hard to be nobody, and now the nobodies were about to go to prison. A shadow fell over his desk. Alexander froze. He didn't close the terminal, that would be suspicious. Instead, he calmly opened a spreadsheet over the code, his face returning to its mask of mild, dull competence. He looked up. Standing there was a man he had only seen in company-wide emails, Roland Paxton. The CEO looked like he hadn't slept since the company's IPO. His suit was impeccable, but his eyes were darting, restless, and sharp enough to cut glass. He wasn't just a boss, he was a man who looked like he expected a knife in his back at any second. "You're the one who fixed the marketing laptop with a paperclip," Roland said. It wasn't a question. His voice was deep, weary, and oddly focused. Alexander blinked, playing the part. Yes, sir. Alexander, from Data Analytics. It was just a bent pin. Roland didn't move. He leaned over Alexander's shoulder, his gaze dropping to the screen. For a terrifying second, Alexander wondered if the CEO could see through the spreadsheet to the illicit terminal beneath. "You're looking at the Moonshine ledger," Roland noted. "Just checking the integration flows, sir," Alexander stammered slightly. "It's a big project. Lots of moving parts." Roland's eyes met his. There was a flicker of something there, not suspicion, but a desperate, lonely sort of curiosity. "Tell me, Alexander. Do you think this project is as secure as my lead developers claim it is?" Alexander felt the weight of his past screaming at him to lie, to fade away, to say "I'm just an analyst." But if he didn't speak up, his quiet life was over anyway. "It's secure from the outside, Mr. Paxton," Alexander said, his voice dropping an octave, gaining a hint of the authority he used to wield. "But the most dangerous thieves don't break in through the window. They already have the keys to the front door." Roland went very still. The air between them suddenly felt charged, the quiet hum of the office fading into the background. For the first time in 3 years, someone was truly looking at Alexander. And for the first time in his life, Roland Paxton felt like he was looking at someone who wasn't trying to sell him a lie. "Come to my office," Roland said quietly. "Now." Chapter 2, The View from the Top. The executive elevator was a sensory deprivation chamber of brushed steel and silence. Alexander stood perfectly still, his reflection in the polished doors revealing nothing but a mid-level employee with a slightly crooked tie. Inside, however, his mind was a kaleidoscope of exit strategies. He could walk out the front door, catch a bus to the regional airport, and be Marcus Thorne by midnight. But as the doors slid open to the penthouse suite, he saw Roland Paxton standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, silhouetted against the smoggy city skyline. The man looked fragile in his expensive wool coat, a titan of industry held together by sheer willpower and caffeine. "Close the door, Alexander," Roland said without turning around. Alexander obeyed. The click of the lock felt like a gavel. The office was vast, decorated in cold marbles and sharp edges, the workspace of a man who didn't want anyone to get close enough to touch him. "You said something downstairs," Roland began, finally turning. His eyes were bloodshot, scanning Alexander's face as if searching for a hidden watermark. "About the front door keys. You weren't talking about hackers." "I was talking about architecture, Mr. Paxton," Alexander said, tucking his hands into his pockets to hide the fact that he was instinctively checking for the weight of a lockpick set he no longer carried. "You can build a vault out of titanium, but if the guy who designed the hinges wants a way in, he's going to build one." Roland walked toward him, stopping just outside the circle of Alexander's personal space. "And what did you see on your screen that made you say that?" Alexander hesitated. This was the precipice. If he showed his hand, the honest analyst died. "I saw a ghost. A 2% variance that disappears into a routing loop. It's a siphon, sir. A very sophisticated one." Roland's breath hitched. He didn't look surprised, he looked devastated. He sank into the edge of his mahogany desk, the terrifying CEO facade cracking to reveal a man drowning in his own success. "I knew it," Roland whispered. "Ever since university, he's been there. Christian. He doesn't just want to steal my ideas, he wants to hollow me out from the inside." He wants to watch me sign my name to a disaster. He looked up at Alexander, his gaze suddenly intense. The board thinks I'm losing my mind. They call it founder's paranoia. They tell me the code is perfect. But you saw it in 5 minutes. I have an eye for discrepancies, Alexander said carefully. I need someone I can trust, Roland said, stepping closer. The air in the room shifted. The professional distance was evaporating. Everyone in this building has a price, or an agenda, or a history with Christian Trinidad. But you? You're a ghost. No office politics, no ego. Just a man with a paperclip and a sharp eye. Alexander felt a pang of guilt, a rare sensation for a man who had once sold a fake, original, Hemingway to a billionaire. Roland was handing him his trust because he thought Alexander was simple. I'll help you, Alexander said. But this stays between us. If the dev team knows I'm auditing them, the ghost will just relocate. Agreed. Roland reached out, as if to shake his hand, but paused. A small, tired smile touched his lips. And Alexander? Enough with the Mr. Paxton. In this office, behind these locked doors, it's just Roland. Alexander looked at him, really looked at him. He saw the tension in Roland's shoulders and the way his fingers trembled slightly. He saw a man who had everything and was terrified of losing his soul to a rival's grudge. All right, Alexander murmured, the name feeling strange and dangerous on his tongue. Roland. Roland's smile widened just a fraction, a genuine spark of warmth breaking through his exhaustion. Good. Now, tell me, Sebastian, he stopped, frowning. I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that. Alexander. Tell me, how do we catch a ghost? Alexander's heart skipped a beat. Sebastian. It was a name he hadn't used in years. He kept his face an absolute mask of confusion. Sebastian? Must be the sleep deprivation, Roland. Right, Roland rubbed his face, dismissing the slip of the tongue. Too many names in my head. Let's get to work. Alexander nodded, but as he turned to the computer terminal Roland was setting up for him, his blood ran cold. He hadn't just found a siphon in the code. He had found a man who, even in his paranoia, had an intuition that was far too sharp for comfort. Chapter 3, The Shadow Partner. The gala for the Global FinTech Initiative was held at the Meridian, a building of glass and ego that pierced the city's skyline like a needle. For Roland, it was a den of vipers. For Alexander, it was a homecoming. You look different, Roland said, his voice trailing off as Alexander stepped into the back of the sleek black sedan. Roland had spent the afternoon pacing his office while Alexander sourced an outfit. The shapeless polyester slacks and beige button-downs of Desk 402 were gone. In their place was a midnight blue velvet dinner jacket that fit Alexander's lean frame like a second skin. His hair, usually flat and unstyled, was swept back, revealing the sharp, aristocratic angles of his face that he usually took great pains to hide. The clothes make the man, Roland, Alexander said, his voice losing its Midwestern nasal flat and smoothing into a cultured, transatlantic lilt. Tonight, I'm not an analyst. I'm your private acquisitions consultant. Keep your answers vague, your smile tight, and let me do the talking. Roland adjusted his cufflinks, his knuckles white. Christian will be there. He'll be looking for a weakness. If he sees me with a stranger, he'll see a man who has finally stopped playing defense, Alexander interrupted, reaching out to steady Roland's hand. The contact was brief, but the warmth lingered. Trust the mask, Roland. It's what I do. The ballroom was a sea of champagne and predatory ambition. Roland was immediately swamped by investors, his body stiffening as he fell back into his rehearsed role of the embattled tech prodigy. Alexander, however, melted into the room. He moved through the crowd like a shadow, his eyes scanning the lapels for a specific pin, the logo of Vanguard Ledger, the shell company he'd traced the 2% siphon to. He found his target near the caviar bar, Julian Vane, a man whose reputation for laundering money was surpassed only by his love for vintage Bordeaux. The 82 Lafite is a bit over-oaked this year, don't you think? Alexander remarked, sliding up beside Vane. Vane turned, eyes narrowing at the newcomer. An 82? Most people in this room couldn't tell the difference between a Lafite and a house red. Most people are here to be seen, Alexander said with a charming, conspiratorial grin. I'm here because my employer is looking to diversify some sensitive assets. We heard Vanguard Ledger was the gold standard for discretion. As Alexander spun a web of financial lies, he caught Roland watching him from across the room. Roland looked mesmerized, his mouth slightly parted. He wasn't seeing the quiet man from the office, he was seeing a predator in his natural habitat. Suddenly, the crowd parted. A man with a sharp, vulpine face and a smile that didn't reach his eyes approached Roland. Christian Trinidad. Roland. You look like you've seen a ghost, Christian laughed, clapping a hand on Roland's shoulder. Roland winced, his anxiety flaring visibly. I heard Moonshine is having stability issues. Such a shame. All that hard work, gone to waste because of a few bad lines of code. Alexander saw Roland falter. The CEO's breathing became shallow, the telltale signs of a brewing panic attack. Alexander didn't hesitate. He excused himself from Vane, intercepted a tray of drinks, and glided into the conversation before Christian could twist the knife. Mr. Trinidad, I presume? Alexander stepped between them, offering a hand. I've heard so much about your work. It's a shame your recent acquisition of the Nordtech patents fell through. A 20% loss in a single quarter must be bruising. Christian's smile froze. The information was private, hidden behind 3 layers of shell companies Alexander had cracked an hour ago in the car. And who are you? Christian hissed. Alexander von Hagen. Roland's shadow, Alexander said, his eyes turning cold and hard. He turned to Roland, his voice softening instantly. Roland, we have that meeting with the Swiss delegates. Shall we? He placed a firm hand on the small of Roland's back, guiding him away from the poison. Once they reached the balcony's shadows, Roland leaned against the stone railing, gasping for air. How did you know? Roland breathed, looking at Alexander with a mixture of awe and terror. The Nordtech loss, nobody knows that. I know a lot of things, Roland, Alexander said, the von Hagen mask slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal the tired grifter beneath. You were incredible, Roland whispered, stepping closer. The moonlight caught the silver in his hair. I've never seen anyone, you handled him like he was nothing. Like you've been doing this your whole life. Alexander looked away, the guilt prickling at his skin. I just don't like bullies. It's more than that, Roland said, reaching out to touch the velvet of Alexander's sleeve. For a moment, I didn't feel like I was drowning. Thank you. Alexander looked at Roland, at the genuine, heart-aching sincerity in the man's eyes, and realized he was in deep trouble. He was supposed to be saving his own skin. Instead, he was starting to want to save Roland's heart. Chapter 4, The 2% Sting. The morning after the gala, the atmosphere in the executive suite had shifted. The cold marble didn't feel quite so freezing, and the silence was no longer heavy with Roland's isolation, it was thick with a shared secret. We have the name of the shell company, but we don't have the key, Alexander said, leaning over a digital map of the Paxton Corp headquarters. The 2% siphon is locked behind a rotating hardware token. It's physical, Roland. It's not on the cloud. Roland sat behind his desk, his eyes tracking Alexander's movements with an intensity that had nothing to do with business. The board member, Roland murmured. Arthur Penhaligon. He's been with the company since my father's time. You're sure it's him? He's the only one with the clearance level and the connection to Julian Vane, Alexander explained. He tapped a finger on the screen. He carries the token on his keychain. Every day at 10:15 a.m., he takes the private elevator from the lobby to the 50th floor for the board briefing. It's a 40-second ride. That's our window. And what am I supposed to do? Roland asked, standing up. I'm not a thief, Alexander. I can't just ask him for his keys. Alexander looked at him, a small, dangerous smirk playing on his lips. You aren't going to do anything but be yourself. You're going to be the stressed, demanding CEO. You're the distraction. I'm the ghost. At 10:14 a.m., the lobby of Paxton Corp was a hive of activity. Alexander was back in his data analyst costume, the slouch was back, the glasses slightly askew, the vibrant energy of the socialite from the night before tucked away in a dark corner of his mind. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open to reveal Arthur Penhaligon, a man who smelled of expensive tobacco and entitlement. Roland stepped in first, his face a mask of cold fury. Arthur, Roland snapped, stepping deep into the elevator's corner. We need to discuss the Q3 projections. Now. Penhaligon sighed, stepping in. Roland, really? Can it not wait for the briefing? Alexander slipped in just as the doors began to close, clutching a stack of folders and a lukewarm coffee. He looked like the picture of a flustered employee. Sorry, excuse me, he mumbled, squeezing between the two men. The elevator began its ascent. The numbers don't add up, Arthur, Roland barked, moving into Penhaligon's personal space. He was playing the part perfectly, aggressive, erratic, the very image of the paranoid founder. He gestured wildly with a tablet. Look at this. Look at the discrepancy. Penhaligon shifted uncomfortably, forced to move his hip away from Roland's pointing finger. Roland, calm down. You're being hysterical. In the cramped space, Alexander tripped as the elevator jolted. Oh. Sorry, sir. Alexander squeaked, his body colliding briefly with Penhaligon. It was a fanning technique Alexander had perfected in the crowded markets of Istanbul. With his left hand, he balanced the coffee and folders. With his right, his fingers moved like a magician's, dipping into Penhaligon's suit pocket, unhooking the heavy keychain from its clip, and sliding the encrypted hardware token into his own palm. In the same fluid motion, he dropped a decoy, a weighted replica he'd spent the night 3D printing, back into the pocket. The entire exchange took 1.2 seconds. Watch where you're going, boy, Penhaligon grunted, brushing his jacket off in disgust. So sorry, sir. Just a bit clumsy, Alexander stammered, his heart rate sitting at a cool, steady 60 beats per minute. The elevator chimed for the 50th floor. The doors opened, and Penhaligon stormed out, Roland trailing behind him, still shouting about projections. Just before the doors closed again to take Alexander back to his floor, Roland looked back. Their eyes met. Alexander gave a microscopic nod and tapped his pocket. 20 minutes later, they were back in Roland's office. Alexander placed the hardware token, a small, black USB device with a glowing blue LED, on the mahogany desk. Roland stared at it like it was a live grenade. You actually did it. I was standing right there, and I didn't see a thing. That's the point, Alexander said, pulling his laptop over to bridge the device. People see what they expect to see. They expected a clumsy analyst. They didn't see the man taking their keys. Roland walked around the desk, standing so close that Alexander could smell the cedarwood and mint on him. Roland reached out, his fingers hovering over Alexander's hand, which was still resting on the laptop. Your hands, Roland whispered. They aren't shaking. Not even a little. Alexander looked down at his own fingers. They were rock steady. Adrenaline is a tool, Roland. If you let it leak out into your limbs, you lose. You have to keep it in your chest. Roland finally closed the gap, his hand covering Alexander's. It wasn't a handshake. It was a grounding, heavy touch. Who are you, Alexander? Truly? Because no data analyst learns how to do that. Alexander felt the mask cracking. The warmth of Roland's palm was a threat to every defense mechanism he had. I'm the man who's going to save your company, he said, his voice dropping to a low, honest rasp. Isn't that enough? Roland's gaze dropped to Alexander's lips, then back to his eyes. The paranoia that usually clouded his face was replaced by a hunger for something real, something Alexander wasn't sure he could provide without burning his whole world down. For now, Roland breathed. For now, it has to be. Chapter 5, Cracks in the Mask. The atmosphere in the executive suite had shifted from a fortress of solitude to a war room of two. For 3 days, Alexander and Roland had lived on black coffee and the electric hum of decrypted data. With the hardware token, they had finally pierced the veil of the 2% siphon, tracing the digital breadcrumbs directly back to Christian Trinidad's personal server. We have him, Roland said, his voice thick with a relief that bordered on exhaustion. He leaned back in his leather chair, watching Alexander navigate the final traces of the transfer. The board will have no choice but to oust Penhaligon. And Christian, this is industrial espionage. He's finished. Alexander didn't smile. He felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck, the instinct that told a grifter when the mark was about to turn. It's too clean, Roland. A man like Trinidad doesn't leave his front door unlocked unless he's waiting behind it with a shotgun. The office doors didn't open, they exploded inward. It wasn't the police or the board. It was Christian Trinidad himself, flanked by 2 stone-faced men in cheap suits. He wasn't fuming, he was gloating. He tossed a thick, manila envelope onto Roland's desk with the flourish of a magician revealing a card. You always were a sentimental fool, Roland, Christian sneered. You were so busy looking for the thief in the code that you didn't notice the wolf sitting in your office. Roland stood, his jaw tight. Get out, Christian. We have the logs. We know about the siphon. Oh, I'm sure you do, Christian countered, gesturing toward the envelope. But I think the SEC will be much more interested in who helped you find them. Open it. Alexander felt the world go gray. He didn't need to see the contents. Roland's fingers trembled as he pulled out the glossy surveillance photos. There was Alexander in Zurich, 3 years ago, sporting blonde hair and a banker's sneer. Alexander in London, wearing a service technician's jumpsuit. And finally, a forensic report on the Alexander von Hagen identity, a void of forged birth certificates and a social security number belonging to a man who had died in 1994. He's a ghost, Roland, Christian whispered, leaning over the desk. A professional con artist. A grifter. He didn't find the siphon, he probably built it to gain your trust. How much has he already taken from you? Or was he waiting for the consultant payout before he vanished? Roland turned to Alexander. The look in his eyes wasn't anger, it was a profound, soul-deep betrayal. It was the look of a man who had finally let down his guard only to find a blade pressed against his throat. Alexander? Roland's voice was a ghost of itself. Tell me he's lying. Tell me there's a reason your fingerprints are flagged in 4 different countries under 4 different names. Alexander opened his mouth, but the Alexander persona, the stuttering, mild-mannered analyst, was dead. He stood up straight, his slouch vanishing, his eyes regaining the hard, cynical clarity of a man who had spent a decade surviving on his wits. He's not lying about the past, Roland, Alexander said, his voice steady and devoid of its fake accent. Roland flinched as if he'd been struck. Was any of it real? The elevator? The gala? Or was I just the latest mark? The siphon is real. Christian is the one stealing from you, Alexander said, moving toward him, but Roland instinctively stepped back, putting the desk between them. The rejection stung more than any arrest warrant. "I can't believe a word you say," Roland choked out. "I don't even know your name." "I saved your company," Alexander said, his voice cracking for the first time. "I saved you." "Did you?" Christian interjected, pulling out his phone. "Because I've already tipped off the authorities. A notorious international fraudster embedded in the CEO's private office? The scandal alone will tank Paxton Corp stock. You're both going down." Alexander looked at Roland, at the man he had grown to love, now paralyzed by the very paranoia Alexander had tried to cure. Alexander knew the math. If he stayed, they both burned. If he ran, he could draw the fire away. "I'm sorry, Roland," Alexander whispered. Before Christian's security could move, Alexander grabbed the hardware token from the desk. He pivoted, vaulted over the side table, and smashed the glass of the emergency fire axe case. He didn't grab the axe, he grabbed the small, heavy canister of specialized suppressant. Pitch. A cloud of blinding white powder filled the room. In the chaos, Alexander didn't head for the door. He headed for the private balcony. "Stop him!" Christian yelled, coughing. Roland stood frozen in the mist, watching the silhouette of the man he thought he knew vanish into the white. He reached out, his hand grasping at nothing but cold air and the fading scent of Alexander's cologne. By the time the air cleared, the balcony was empty. Alexander von Hagen was gone. All that remained on the desk was a small, handwritten note Alexander had palmed there during the confusion. "The siphon ends at the Vesper server. I fixed the leak. Don't let him win." Roland sank into his chair, clutching the note. He was safe. His company was saved. But as he looked at the surveillance photos of the man with 1,000 faces, he realized he would trade every cent of Paxton Corp just to see the real one. Chapter 6: The Vanishing Act. The rain in the city didn't wash things clean, it just turned the grime into a slick, reflective oil. Alexander, now Julian Reed, a freelance courier with a slight limp and a penchant for cheap cigarettes, sat in a cramped, windowless basement apartment that smelled of damp concrete and ozone. On the table before him sat 3 burner laptops, their screens casting a rhythmic blue strobe across his face. He was no longer the polished socialite of the Meridian Gala, nor the slouching analyst of Desk 402. He was a ghost in the machine, a digital wraith systematically dismantling a king. "One more node," Alexander muttered, his fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard. He wasn't running. He was hunting. Christian Trinidad had made a fatal mistake. He assumed a grifter's only weapon was his face. He forgot that to be a banker, Alexander had to master finance. To be an analyst, he had to master the architecture of greed. Alexander tapped into the Vesper server he'd mentioned in his note to Roland. It was a labyrinth of illicit transactions, but to Alexander's trained eyes, it was a map. He began to execute a series of flash crashes on Christian's offshore shell companies. He wasn't just stealing the money back, he was making the funds look like they were being used to finance illegal arms trades. By sunrise, the SEC wouldn't just be looking at a corporate rivalry, they would be looking at a global criminal enterprise with Christian Trinidad's name at the center. Across the city, the lights in the Paxton Corp penthouse hadn't been turned off for 3 days. Roland sat at his desk, the Alexander von Hagen dossier spread out like a morbid jigsaw puzzle. The authorities had been and gone. They had searched Alexander's apartment and found nothing. No clothes, no fingerprints, not even a stray hair. The man had scrubbed his existence with the clinical efficiency of a professional. "Sir," his new assistant whispered from the door. "The market just opened. Trinidad Group stock is in a freefall. There are rumors of a federal raid on their headquarters." Roland didn't look up from a photo of Alexander, the one from Zurich. Alexander was smiling in the photo, a predatory, confident look that Roland had never seen in person. "It's him," Roland whispered. "Sir?" "He's doing it for me," Roland said, a pained realization twisting in his chest. "He's burning his bridges to clear my path." Roland stood up and walked to the window. He knew how this worked. Alexander would finish the job, delete his current trail, and vanish into a new city with a new name. He would become a barista in Seattle, or a tour guide in Rome, and Roland would spend the rest of his life wondering if every stranger who caught his eye was the man who had saved him. Roland turned to the assistant. "Cancel my meetings. Call the private investigators I hired, the ones who specialize in untraceable backgrounds." "Sir, they said the trail is cold." "Then tell them to stop looking for Alexander von Hagen," Roland snapped, his voice regaining the steel it had lost. "Tell them to look for a ghost who leaves behind fixed problems and broken hearts. Look for the man who doesn't exist." Back in the basement, Alexander watched the final bar of the progress meter turn green. Christian Trinidad's primary accounts were locked. The evidence was sitting on the desks of 3 different federal agencies. Alexander took a long drag of his cigarette and exhaled slowly. He reached for a small bottle of acetone and began the tedious process of dissolving the adhesive of the Sebastian Cole identity he'd been prepping as a backup. He looked at the burner phone on the table. He wanted to call Roland. He wanted to hear that deep, weary voice call him Alexander one last time. He wanted to explain that the man Roland fell for wasn't a total lie, that the protective instinct, the way his heart stuttered when their hands touched, was the only real thing he had left. But a grifter knew when the play was over. He snapped the burner phone in half, tossed the laptops into a tub of acid, and picked up a single duffel bag. As he climbed the stairs out of the basement and stepped into the gray morning light, the limp in his leg vanished. His shoulders squared. His face settled into a look of polite, vacant boredom. Alexander von Hagen was dead. He walked toward the train station, passing a newsstand where the headline blared, "Trinidad Empire Collapses." Alexander didn't even glance at it. He bought a ticket to a city he'd never been to, under a name he'd never used. He was a blank slate again. But as the train pulled out of the station, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dried-out succulent leaf, the one from his desk at Paxton Corporation. He held it for a long moment before closing his fist, keeping the one piece of his boring life he couldn't bring himself to throw away. Chapter 7: The Empty Chair. 6 months had passed since the name Alexander von Hagen had been scrubbed from the directories of Paxton Corporation. For the rest of the world, the story was a closed chapter. Christian Trinidad was facing 30 years for money laundering, and Paxton Corp stock had reached an all-time high. But for Roland, the silence was deafening. He sat in his office, which now felt more like a mausoleum than a place of business. He had become an expert in ghosts. He had spent a fortune on digital forensics, not to find a criminal, but to find a trace of a soul. He knew that Alexander had stayed in the city for 48 hours after the explosion in the office, long enough to bankrupt Christian and short enough to vanish before the first siren reached the lobby. Roland looked at the map on his wall, pinned with locations where Alexander-like activity had been reported. A high-stakes card shark in Macau. A brilliant anonymous auditor in London. A silent partner in a Singaporean tech firm. "You're looking for a man who wants to be found, sir," his lead investigator had told him a month ago. "This man, he's a master of the exit. He doesn't leave crumbs. He leaves voids." "Then look for the voids," Roland had replied. 2,000 miles away, in a coastal city where the air smelled of salt and diesel, a man named Elias Thorne worked as a marine logistics coordinator. Elias was a man of quiet habits. He wore rugged canvas jackets, kept his hair cropped short, and spoke with a soft, rolling accent that suggested a childhood in the Pacific Northwest. He lived in a studio apartment above a bait shop and spent his Saturdays helping local fishermen optimize their fuel consumption using a knack for numbers he claimed to have picked up in the Navy. He was happy. Or, at least, he was safe. Alexander, now Elias, stood on the pier, clipboard in hand, watching a cargo crane hoist a shipping container. The sun was setting, painting the harbor in bruised purples and golds. It was a far cry from the velvet and marble of his life with Roland, but it was honest. Mostly. Thorn. Phone for you in the office, the dock manager yelled. Some guy asking about the Q4 manifests. Alexander felt the familiar, cold prickle of adrenaline. He smoothed his expression into one of mild, worker-bee annoyance. Tell him I'll be there in 5. He walked toward the small, weathered shack that served as the harbor office. As he stepped inside, he saw a man standing by the window, his back to the door. The man was wearing a suit that cost more than the entire pier, its charcoal wool looking alien against the salt-stained walls. Alexander's heart didn't just beat, it slammed against his ribs. He knew that silhouette. He knew the way those shoulders carried the weight of the world. He almost turned. He almost stepped back out into the salt spray and vanished into the shipping containers, never to be seen again. It would be the easiest thing in the world to become Elias somewhere else. But he was tired. He was so incredibly tired of being a shadow. The Q4 manifests aren't ready yet, Alexander said, his voice dropping into the steady, unaccented tone of the man who had once fixed a laptop with a paperclip. Roland Paxton turned around. He looked older. There were lines of silver at his temples that hadn't been there 6 months ago, and his eyes were sunken, as if he'd forgotten how to sleep. When he saw Alexander, he didn't move. He didn't yell. He just let out a long, shaky breath, his entire body sagging with the weight of a quest finally ended. It took me 3 months to realize you wouldn't go to a big city, Roland said, his voice raspy. I started looking for small ports. Places where a man with your specific skill set could make himself indispensable to people who don't ask questions. Alexander leaned against the doorframe, his thumb tracing the edge of his clipboard. You should have stayed in the penthouse, Roland. You're a long way from home. Home was a lie until you walked into it, Roland countered, stepping forward. He stopped a few feet away, respecting the invisible boundary Alexander had drawn. I didn't come here to arrest you. I didn't even come here to bring you back to the company. Then why are you here? Roland looked at him with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. To see if the man who saved me was still in there. Or if he was just another mask. Alexander looked down at his rough, grease-stained hands. He thought about the midnight blue velvet jacket. He thought about the 2% siphon. Then he thought about the way Roland's hand had felt on his in the elevator. There is no real man, Roland, Alexander whispered. It's just layers. All the way down. Then I'll learn every layer, Roland promised. One by one. Until I find the one that loves me back. Alexander felt a lump in his throat he couldn't swallow. He wanted to run. He wanted to stay. For the first time in a decade, the grifter had no script. Chapter 8, Nice to meet you. The air in the harbor office was thick with the smell of salt and the low, rhythmic hum of the tide. Sebastian, no longer Elias, and certainly no longer Alexander, stood amidst the shadows of the cramped room, watching the way the orange sunset caught the silver in Roland's hair. Roland took a step closer, his breath hitching as he looked at the man he had chased across a dozen state lines. I've spent months looking for a ghost, Roland whispered. But you're right here. You're always just, right here. Sebastian felt a strange, terrifying lightness in his chest. The duplicity, the layers of von Hagen, the 1,000 faces he had worn, they felt like a heavy coat he was finally ready to drop. He stepped fully into the light, his eyes meeting Roland's with a raw clarity that was almost blinding. I'm tired of being a shadow, Roland, he said, his voice dropping its rugged coastal accent. I'm tired of being the man you think I am. He took Roland's hand, not as an employee, and not as a mark. He held it with the steady, quiet strength of a partner. My name isn't Elias. And it was never Alexander, he said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. Hello. I'm Sebastian Cole. Nice to meet you, Roland. Roland froze. The name hit him like a physical blow, reverberating through his mind with a haunting familiarity. He gripped Sebastian's hand tighter, his eyes widening as a memory, sudden and sharp, unlocked in his mind. Sebastian, Roland breathed, the word tasting like a ghost on his tongue. He looked at Sebastian, his mind racing back to that frantic afternoon in the executive suite 6 months ago, when they were both drowning in caffeine and paranoia. That day in the office, when we were looking at the code. I called you Sebastian. I thought it was sleep deprivation. I thought my brain had just malfunctioned. Sebastian's smile widened, though it was tinged with a faint, lingering sadness. I remember. You said it so naturally, like you had been calling me that for years. I had to freeze. I had to make sure my face didn't shatter right then and there. He looked down at their joined hands. It was the first time in 10 years I had heard my real name spoken out loud. It sounded so familiar, yet so foreign at the same time, like a language I used to speak fluently but had forgotten the rhythm of. For a split second, I actually thought I had slipped up, that I had told you without knowing it. Roland's heart hammered against his ribs. The slip of the tongue hadn't been a mistake, it had been an instinct. Even back then, through the fear and the sabotage, his soul had been reaching for the man behind the mask. I didn't know, Roland whispered, his thumb tracing the knuckles of Sebastian's hand. I just looked at you and that was the only name that made sense. I didn't want the analyst. I wanted you. You found me, Roland, Sebastian said, his voice thick with emotion. Even when I didn't want to be found, you called me by my name. Roland didn't let go. He pulled Sebastian closer, the expensive wool of his coat brushing against the rough canvas of the worker's jacket. He realized then that the grifter hadn't been the one in control, their connection had been the only real thing in a world built on lies. Nice to meet you, Sebastian Cole, Roland murmured, his forehead resting against Sebastian's. I'm not letting you go again. Epilogue. 3 months after the salt-sprayed winds of the coast, the air was warmer, scented with expensive espresso and the crisp pages of a morning newspaper. They were in a villa in Tuscany, a temporary retirement that Roland had insisted upon while his new legal team finished scrubbing the last of the Trinidad litigation. Sebastian, formerly Alexander, sat on the sun-drenched terrace, wearing a linen shirt and a pair of spectacles that he actually needed for reading. Roland stepped out onto the terrace, holding 2 cups of coffee. He paused, watching Sebastian work. Sebastian had 3 different tablets open, one was tracking the Tokyo Stock Exchange, another was playing a high-speed chess match against a Grandmaster AI, and the third was open to a local Italian news site. You're doing it again, Roland said, setting the coffee down. Sebastian didn't look up, but his lips quirked into a smile. Doing what? Being 4 people at once, Roland teased, leaning over the back of the chair to kiss the top of Sebastian's head. The banker, the analyst, and the local linguist. You're supposed to be relaxing. I am relaxing, Sebastian insisted, finally turning his head to look at Roland. His eyes were clear, the haunted, hypervigilant edge replaced by a soft, playful glow. If I don't keep my brain moving, I might accidentally start pickpocketing the gardener just for the practice. Roland laughed, pulling a small, velvet box from his pocket and sliding it across the marble table. Sebastian froze. His eyes darted to the box, his analytical mind immediately calculating the weight, the brand, and the intent. Roland? Open it. Sebastian flipped the latch. Inside wasn't a diamond or a gold band. It was a high-security biometric keycard, sleek and black, embossed with a logo Sebastian didn't recognize, Cole and Paxton Associates. I bought a boutique cybersecurity firm in London, Roland explained, his voice dropping to that serious, steady register Sebastian loved. They specialize in impossible recoveries. I want you to head the department. No masks, no fake names. Just you, your brain, and a legal team that makes sure you never have to run again. Sebastian picked up the card, feeling its weight. He looked at the name on the card, Sebastian Cole, Chief of Operations. A real job? Sebastian asked, his voice a bit raspy. With a real name? People might find me boring, Roland. Roland pulled Sebastian up from the chair, drawing him into a firm, grounding embrace. He looked at the man who had been 1,000 people, seeing only the one he wanted to spend his life with. Let them be bored, Roland whispered, his forehead resting against Sebastian's. I'll be the only one who knows that the man behind the desk is the most dangerous, and most incredible, person in the room. Sebastian reached up, his fingers sliding into the silver at Roland's temples. He didn't need a mask to feel safe anymore. He just needed this. Well, Sebastian murmured, a flash of the old grifter's spark in his eyes. In that case, Mr. Paxton. I think I'm going to need a very large signing bonus. Roland grinned, pulling him closer. I think we can negotiate the terms. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe to help the channel grow. See you in the next story.